Hey, my name is Owen. I'm 34 years old, and I live in a small house on Pembroke Street in Hanover, Wisconsin. A flat, quiet college town of about 12,000 people in the southwestern part of the state, where the roads run long and straight and the winters announce themselves in October and stay until they feel like leaving. I have lived here my whole life, which is not something most people my age say with ease, but I say it without difficulty, because this is the place I know the way I know my own body, by feel, by memory, by the specific quality of light at different hours, on different roads. I drive for a living. Early mornings, before most of Hanover is awake, I run the delivery route for a regional bakery called Pierce's. 22 stops across 4 counties, every road memorized, every loading dock timed, every curve and incline and trouble spot logged somewhere in my body in a way that is no longer conscious and has not been conscious for several years. I leave the depot at 4:15 in the morning. I finish around noon. I know the roads of this county the way a piano player knows a piece they have played for 10 years. Not note by note, but as a whole, as a thing the hands do without the brain directing them. I know where the road shoulders narrow on Route 9. I know which bridge on County B gets icy fastest in November. I know the 3 intersections in the county where someone is eventually going to make a mistake, and I approach all 3 of them with the same particular attention every single time, without exception. I have driven this route in sun and sleet and fog, and the specific white darkness of a February morning, when the snow falls horizontally and the road disappears 10 feet in front of you. I drive carefully. I have driven carefully for 8 years, since the December when my brother Garrett missed a turn on Highway 14 in bad weather, just a wrong read of the road, just the kind of moment that can happen to anyone and usually doesn't matter. And it mattered. He was 27, I was 26. The roads changed for me after that. They did not become frightening. They became something I decided to take seriously, which is a different thing. My days outside the route are quieter. I come home around noon, eat something, sleep for a few hours in the afternoon the way shift workers do, not fully, just enough, and wake up around 4 or 5 when the light has changed. I work on the house when it needs it, which is often enough that I have developed a basic competence at most things a house requires. I see my mother on Sundays. I have a friend named Curtis who runs the hardware store, and who is the kind of friend you can go 3 weeks without talking to and then see at the diner and have it be exactly the same. I am not going to tell you I was unhappy. That would not be accurate. I was a man with a house and a route and a reason to be somewhere at 4:15 every morning, and there is a specific kind of steadiness in that which I am not willing to underestimate. But I will say that there were evenings in the hour before I went to bed when I would sit on my porch and watch the street and feel a quality of silence that was not quite peaceful, a silence that had something missing from it that I had stopped trying to name. I had made my peace with it. I had also, without fully deciding to, gotten very careful about the idea of making something mine and then losing it. Garrett used to say I drove like I was protecting something. I did not ask him what he meant. I have thought about it many times since. About a year before this story begins, a woman moved into the rental house across the street. I noticed her the way you notice a new neighbor, the moving truck, the boxes, the particular careful way someone moves through a space they are still deciding about. She was there in the mornings when I got back from the route, usually on her porch with coffee and what looked like a work laptop, and she was there in the evenings when I sat on mine. We exchanged the usual brief words across the street. Her name was Dana. She had come from Chicago. She worked remotely, something in project management, and she had come to Hanover because the rent made sense, and she needed, as she put it once in passing, a place that wasn't anywhere she'd been before. I understood that. I did not ask about it. She was there for about 8 months before she knocked on my door. It was a Saturday evening in October, and she had the slightly braced expression of someone who has rehearsed a short conversation and is hoping to get through it without too much difficulty. She said she had asked 3 people in Hanover if they would teach her to drive, and all 3 had found reasons it wouldn't work. And she had been watching me park my truck on the street for 8 months, with what she described as what I can only call annoying precision, and she was wondering if I would consider it. I almost said no. I had a long route on Saturdays. I was tired. She was my neighbor, not a project. Teaching someone to drive requires patience and attention and a very specific willingness to be in a small space with someone who is about to make mistakes that will concern you. I had been alone in my truck for 10 years. I knew how I liked that, but there was something about the way she asked it. The particular honesty of someone who has been turned down 3 times and is asking a 4th time anyway, without performing confidence she doesn't have, without making it seem smaller than it is, that I found I couldn't send away. I said, Saturday mornings, 8 o'clock, the church parking lot on Maple. She said, I'll be there. She was there at 7:52. The first morning, she sat in the driver's seat of her borrowed car, her neighbor's old Corolla, automatic, forgiving, and she gripped the wheel with both hands at 10 and 2, in a way that told me everything I needed to know about her current relationship with the vehicle. I said, Your hands tell a car the same thing your face tells a room. Everything you're feeling goes right through them. She looked at me. She said, That's not helpful. I said, No. But it's accurate. She considered this. Then she put the car in drive and we moved forward about 15 feet before she braked too hard and we both lurched into our seatbelts. I said, You're not stopping a runaway train. She said, I don't know where the brake actually is relative to the gas. I can't feel it yet. I said, That's what we're here for. By the end of that first morning, she could drive in a straight line across the parking lot and brake at roughly the pressure required to not jolt both occupants forward. She could not turn yet. She could not judge the edge of the car. She sat in the driver's seat at the end of the session looking out through the windshield with the expression of a person who has just been told the mountain is larger than it appeared from the trailhead, and I said, You're further along than you think. She said, I drove in a straight line across a parking lot. I said, Most people who've been driving for 20 years can't brake that evenly after 30 minutes. She gave me the sideways look of someone evaluating whether they're being told the truth or managed. I said, I'm not trying to manage you. It's just true. She nodded once, in the way she had of receiving information she intended to check later. There is a principle about roads that took me years to understand. A road you drive for the first time is a sequence of unfamiliar demands. This turn, that yield sign, the lane that narrows without warning. A road you've driven 100 times is a body memory. But there is a stage in between that is more difficult than either, and it is the stage where you know the road well enough that you stop paying attention, but not well enough to rely on instinct. That middle stage is where most mistakes happen. Garrett knew that road. He had driven it a dozen times. He stopped seeing it. Dana was not in the middle stage. She was at the beginning, which is actually the safer place. Fully alert, fully present. No assumptions yet. There was something I found I respected about the quality of attention she brought to those early lessons. Most beginners are anxious in a way that narrows their focus to the immediate thing. The next stop sign, the next turn. She was anxious too, but she was also observing. She asked questions that went past the immediate. Not just, how do I do this? But why does it work this way? What is the car actually doing? How do I know the difference between traction and the illusion of traction? I had been driving for 18 years, and some of her questions made me think about the road differently. The second Saturday, we moved on to the residential streets around the church. She drove at 11 miles per hour through a 25 zone, both hands locked at 10 and 2. Eyes scanning with the systematic sweep of someone checking every possible direction with equal anxiety. I said, "The road doesn't know you're nervous." She said, "Also not helpful." I said, "I'm not in the business of helpful. I'm in the business of accurate." She said, "You've said that before." I said, "Because it keeps being true." There was a beat of silence. Then she laughed. A brief, surprised sound, the kind of laugh that comes out before the person decides to let it. I noticed it. I did not comment on it. I filed it in the category of things I was paying attention to without naming. By the end of the second morning, she could navigate a turn, a four-way stop, and a parallel street without my having to intervene. She could not yet trust herself to react to anything unexpected. That was week 3. She was doing her homework. I did not know this until the 4th Saturday, when I was walking her through the technique for merging onto a highway, her speed on the ramp, her mirror check, the gap she was looking for. And she said, in the careful tone of someone who has checked their information twice before saying it, "The published guidance actually recommends matching speed before checking for gaps, not after." I told her my method worked. She said it did, but it was technically not what the manual said, and she wanted to know why I did it differently. I checked my phone. She was right. I had been merging a particular way for 15 years because that was how Garrett had taught me, and Garrett had learned from someone older than him, and the guidance had quietly been updated somewhere in the chain. I said, "You read the entire manual." She said, "I read everything before I do it. It just takes me a while to start doing it." I said, "That seems like an important thing to know about yourself." She looked at me the way she sometimes looked at me, as though she was deciding whether what I'd said was a simple observation or something she needed to think about. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think it is." She merged onto the highway on the 3rd attempt, clean and confident, and once we were up to speed, she went quiet in a way she hadn't in any of the previous sessions. Not anxious quiet. Focused quiet. The highway does that to new drivers when they suddenly find their footing. It is all demand and no uncertainty. Every lane going the same direction, and the car finds its own steadiness. I watched the road, and I watched her hands, which had come down from 10 and 2 into something more relaxed, something that was starting to look like ease. And I thought, there it is. That's the moment you stop fighting the car and start driving it. I did not say this out loud. Some things land better unsaid. The 5th Saturday, her borrowed car had a flat tire in the parking lot of the grocery store on Elm. She had driven there to practice the parking lot circuits we'd been working on and found the rear left tire sitting on the rim when she came out with a bag of groceries. She called me because my number was the most recent in her phone. I drove over. I jacked the car and changed it while she held the lug nuts in her palm and passed them to me when I asked. We did not talk much. It was 20 minutes of work in a grocery store parking lot on a cold October afternoon, and neither of us made it into more than it was. When I was done, I put the flat in her trunk and told her to get the spare replaced before she drove on it again. And she said she would, and she looked at the tire for a moment and then at me. She said, "I could have called a tow." I said, "I know." She said, "You were 20 minutes away doing nothing." I said I wasn't doing nothing. I was eating lunch. She said, "That's doing something." I said, "It was a Tuesday. Lunch doesn't count." She gave me the evaluating look again. Then she said, quietly, "Thank you." Not in the automatic way. In the way that means it. I said, "You're welcome," and drove home and ate the rest of my lunch standing at the kitchen counter, thinking about the way she'd held those lug nuts in her palm with such care, like she was making sure she didn't drop something that mattered. The following Saturday was the one where something changed between us in a way neither of us named. We were on the county road, flat, straight, almost no traffic, and she was holding a steady 60, both hands easy on the wheel for the first time. Not gripping, just holding. I noticed, and I did not say anything because saying it would have made her self-conscious and she would have gripped again. We drove for about 10 minutes without speaking. The fields on either side were stripped bare, and the sky was that particular wide gray of late October that makes Wisconsin look like it extends forever. She said, without looking away from the road, "Do you ever get bored of it?" I said, "Of what?" She said, "The same route. Every day." I thought about it. I said, "No. The road changes. Not the road itself. The road is the same. But the light changes. The conditions change. The way the truck handles changes depending on the load and the temperature. You think you're driving the same road. You're not. You're driving today's version of it." She considered this. She said, "That's either very zen or you're just good at finding ways to not be bored." I said, "Probably both." She laughed. Not the brief, surprised kind from the early lessons. A real one. Longer. The kind that comes from someone who has relaxed into the company they're in. I looked at the road ahead and let myself notice that I was not in a hurry for this lesson to end. I had not been in a hurry for the last 4, either. I was doing the careful thing. The thing I do with roads, the paying attention thing, and I was beginning to understand that what I was paying attention to was not only the driving. I said, "You ready to take an exit and get back on?" She said, "Yes." "Which one?" I said, "Your call." She picked the next one. She did it correctly. She didn't say anything about it, which was its own kind of confidence. After the 6th lesson, we sat in the parked car outside my house as the light went down. It had been a good session. She had managed a 3-point turn, a parallel park attempt that almost worked, and 20 minutes on the highway at the speed limit, rather than 5 miles below it. She had not yet gotten out of the car. Neither had I. The particular quality of the day and the long, low light made the interior of the car feel like a place apart from the rest of the evening. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Why did you say yes when I asked you?" I said, "You asked a 4th time, after 3 no's." She said, "That's a reason?" I said, "Someone who asks a 4th time after 3 no's either wants the thing very badly or needs it very badly. I couldn't tell which it was for you, but either way it seemed worth saying yes to." She was quiet. Outside, the street was going to dusk. She said, "I was with someone for 7 years. In Chicago. He drove everywhere. Not because I couldn't. I just never needed to. He planned everything, drove everything, decided everything, and I let him because it was easier and it felt like being taken care of, and I didn't understand for a long time that being taken care of and being seen were not the same thing. When I finally left, which took me longer than it should have, I didn't have a license. I didn't have a route. I didn't have any of the basic machinery of going somewhere on my own because I had been a passenger for so long I'd forgotten I had legs. She stopped. She looked at the dashboard. She said, "I kept walking to the passenger side of the car out of habit. Months after I moved here. My own car, I'd go around to the passenger side and stand there. And then remember there was no one in the driver's seat. There was no one who was going to drive me anywhere. I had to go around. I said, "How long did that last?" She said, 3 months. I did not say anything immediately. I looked at the street. Then I said, "My brother taught me to drive. He was 4 years older. He died 8 years ago. Wrong turn on Highway 14 in bad weather. The road was the same road he'd driven a dozen times. He just stopped seeing it." She said, "I'm sorry, Owen," I said. "He used to tell me that the problem with knowing a road well is you start navigating from memory instead of from attention. You stop looking at where you actually are and start assuming." He meant it about driving. I think he meant it about other things too. He was better than me at knowing when something was both things at once. She said, "Is that why you drive the way you do?" I said, "I drive the way I do because the roads deserve it. Because they don't change just because you've decided you know them." She looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in the quality of her attention. A slight settling, the way a car stops handling and starts moving when you find the right speed. She said, "I'm trying to learn how to see where I actually am." I said, "I know. I've been watching." She put her hand flat on the dashboard, not reaching for anything, just grounding herself. I did not reach for her hand. I looked out the windshield at the ordinary street. After a moment she said it was getting dark, and she got out, and I sat in the car alone for another minute before I went inside. The Saturday before Thanksgiving, I came back from my route to find a car I did not recognize in the street, a rental, from the plates, and a man I had not met, leaning against it on the sidewalk outside Dana's house. He was around 40, well put together, carrying himself with the ease of someone who has generally found the world to be on his side. He was looking at his phone with the patience of someone who knows he will be answered eventually. She came out. I was parking my truck. She did not see me yet. He said something. She stood on her porch steps and looked at him with an expression I had learned to read over the past 2 months. The careful, measured look of someone assessing whether something is going to cost them more than it's worth. He held out something toward her. I was far enough that I couldn't see what. She shook her head. He spoke again. She said something I couldn't hear. He nodded, as if he'd expected it, as if her no was something he intended to wait out. I went about my business. I had things to do. I did them, in the driveway and then in the garage, and I was aware the whole time of the conversation on the other side of the street without watching it. At some point I heard a car start and drive away. I went inside. She called that evening. She said the man outside was Marcus, my ex. A friend told him where I was. He drove from Chicago with a plant because I always said I wanted a plant, and he remembered that. I said, "What did he want?" She said, to explain himself. He said he'd had time to think and he realized he hadn't given me enough room. He said some people need to be managed. He said it kindly. He said it like it was a fact that I should already know about myself. I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said I'd learned to drive." I waited. She said, "He said that was good, but what did that have to do with anything?" And I said I didn't know how to explain it to him. I just knew it had everything to do with everything. I said, "Do you need to explain it to him?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, I really don't." He came back on Sunday. I was in the driveway. He came across the street and introduced himself with the particular confidence of a man who is very comfortable taking up space in any situation. He said he'd heard I'd been teaching Dana to drive. He said it pleasantly, with the implication underneath that he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about it. He said she was always nervous about new things, and he appreciated me being patient with her. But he wanted to make sure she wasn't getting in over her head. I said she merged onto a highway at 65 miles an hour on her fourth try. I've taught 5 people to drive. She's the quickest study I've had. He absorbed this. He said, she tends to need a lot of guidance. I said, most people do. When they're learning something. That's not the same as needing to be managed. He looked at me for a moment. He had the specific expression of a man who is accustomed to being the one who makes assessments of other people and is not used to being assessed himself. He said, I drove a long way to talk to her. I said, she knows where to find you if she wants to continue the conversation. He went back across the street. Dana came to the door and they talked for 10 minutes. I did not watch, but I was aware of it the way you are aware of weather, not looking directly at it, but knowing it's there, knowing it's deciding something. When his rental car was gone, she stood on her porch for a moment, with her arms folded across her chest, not cold, just contained. Then she walked across the street. She said, I told him I wasn't the same person who needed what he was offering. I said, how did that land? She said, he asked who I was now then. And I said I was still figuring it out. He said that was exactly what he was worried about. I said, what did you say to that? She said, I said that was the first time in 7 years I'd been excited about something instead of afraid of it. Then I said goodbye. We stood there in the driveway. The rental car was gone. The street was ordinary again. Just the street. The bare November trees. The cold. She said, are we doing a lesson Saturday? I said, if you want. She said, I want to practice parallel parking. I said, that's the last thing most people want to practice. She said, I know. I've been parking in the back of every lot for 2 months because I can't do it yet. I want to be able to stop doing that. I looked at her. There was a specific quality to the way she said it, not frustration, not self-criticism, just a plain statement of something she had decided needed to be different. The same quality she'd brought to everything over the past 9 Saturdays. Not performing bravery, just deciding and then doing. I said, Saturday. 8 o'clock. She passed her driving test on a Tuesday in early December. I know this because she called me from the DMV parking lot at 11:24 in the morning, before she called anyone else, and said, I passed. The Wednesday before the test, I had run into Curtis at the hardware store. Curtis, who is 61 and has known me since I was 19, and who has the particular quality of a man who does not say unnecessary things, which means when he does say something, you pay attention. He had seen Dana's car in my driveway several Saturday mornings and made no comment for 2 months, which was itself a comment. Then on Wednesday he said, ringing up a bag of weather stripping I did not actually need, you're different lately. I said, different how? He said, you stopped driving past the diner at noon. I said, I've been eating at home. He said, I know. That's what I mean. He handed me the bag. He said, she's still learning to drive? I said, she tests Tuesday. He looked at me the way he sometimes did, with the plainness of a man who has watched a lot of people make things harder than they needed to be. He said, don't make her wait too long after that. Some people, once they can drive themselves anywhere, you don't want them to have to decide on their own where to go. I said he was being dramatic. He said, I've known you 15 years. I'm being accurate. I did not have a response to that. I took my weather stripping and left. I said, I know. She said, you don't know. I just told you. I said, I mean I knew you would. She said, you can't know that. I said, "I've been in the car with you for 9 Saturdays. I watched you drive in a straight line for the first time. I watched you figure out the merge 3 tries in. I watched you parallel park on Main Street in the snow last week on the 2nd attempt and not even comment on it like it was something you'd always been able to do." I knew. There was a pause. She said, "I'm going to go call my mother." I said, "Go call your mother." She said, "Thank you." And then, "Owen." I said yes. She said, "I'll see you tonight?" It was not a lesson. We had no lesson that evening. I said yes anyway. She came at 6 with a 6-pack of whatever was on sale at the gas station, which was not good beer, and I didn't say that. We sat on my porch in the cold because the evening was clear and neither of us wanted to be inside on a night like this. She had the particular quality of quiet that comes after something you've been working toward for a long time finally becomes real. Not elated, not dramatic, just settled. Like the car had finally stopped fighting her and she'd stopped fighting it back. We talked about small things for a while. The route, the cold, the neighbor 2 doors down who had started putting up Christmas lights in October and had recently added a new display element that could only be described as ambitious. She laughed when I described it. She laughed more easily than she had in October, which I had been noticing for weeks without saying anything. Then she said, when I was sitting in the car at the start of the test, right before the examiner got in. I said, "Yeah." She said, "I thought about what you told me. About your brother. About paying attention to where you actually are instead of where you think you should be. I've been thinking about it since you said it." I said, "Did it help?" She said, "You help. Not just the driving. I know that's a strange thing to say. But you help." She looked at her beer. She said, "I spent so long being a passenger. Not just in cars, in everything." And I told myself that was because Marcus was better at deciding things, or because I didn't care enough about routes to fight for them, or because it was just easier. And some of that was true. But some of it was that I stopped trusting myself to know where I wanted to go. And then I stopped practicing going anywhere, and then I forgot I knew how. She stopped. She said, "You gave me back the steering wheel." That's what it felt like. Lesson by lesson. "You just kept handing me the wheel." I said, "It was always yours. You just hadn't driven it in a while." She looked at me. The porch was cold and the street was quiet, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at the highway on the first day she merged, like she had just found the speed and was deciding whether to commit to it. She said, "I don't ever want a different teacher." I said, "For driving?" She said it quietly, "Just for me, for any of it." I put down my beer. I reached over and took her hand. She looked at our hands for a long moment. She turned hers over so our palms were together. Her hands were cold from the bottle. I held them anyway. She said, "I walked to the passenger side again last week." I said, "When?" She said, "Getting into your truck. When you drove us to the hardware store." I went to the passenger side out of habit. Then I caught myself. I said, "I saw." She said, "You didn't say anything." I said, "You caught yourself." She leaned her head against my shoulder. We stayed on the porch until the cold became a fact we couldn't argue with, and then we went inside, and neither of us left that night in any hurry. 8 months later, she drives to work every morning. 15 minutes each way, a route she knows well enough now that she has stopped consciously navigating it, which is how you know a road has become yours. When you arrive and don't remember the individual turns, only the quality of the drive. She has her own car. A used Civic, silver, with a small dent in the rear bumper she keeps meaning to get fixed and keeps deciding does not bother her enough to bother. She parallel parked on Main Street last Tuesday in one clean move. I was on my route, driving past on the way to the bakery's third drop, and I saw her do it. I texted her at the next stop, clean. She texted back, I know. I texted, I know you know. She texted, go deliver your bread. Marcus's plant is on her windowsill. She almost threw it out twice and decided against it both times, for reasons she has explained to me, and that I find completely logical. The plant has nothing to do with him, and she likes plants. And the best response to something you inherited from a person who underestimated you is to let it thrive. It is doing very well. She still calls me when something goes wrong with the car, not because she can't handle it, but because I told her once that even people who know what they're doing get second opinions, and she took that seriously in ways I only partially intended. I don't mind. I am constitutionally suited to second opinions. In June, we took a road trip. No destination, just a direction, northwest, generally toward Minnesota. We had never traveled together. We discovered on the first day that we both navigate by landmarks rather than GPS, which meant we had to actively talk through the route instead of following instructions, which meant we spent the first hour debating a turn and the next 3 hours agreeing on everything else. She drove the first 200 miles. I drove the next 3. She fell asleep somewhere in central Wisconsin and slept for 100 miles while I drove, and the light changed, and the fields went flat and wide in the late afternoon, and I looked at her sleeping in the passenger seat with her head against the window. This woman, who had forgotten how to navigate anywhere, who had stood outside the DMV and called me first, and I thought about Garrett, which is not something I do as often or as painfully as I once did. He had said I drove like I was protecting something. I had not understood it then. I understand it now. Not the thing he meant, probably. The thing I mean. I have driven these roads for 10 years. I know them by feel, by the specific sensation of the wheel in a curve, by the way the grade changes on County B a mile before the bridge. I know them the way you know anything you have paid real attention to for a long time. But there are roads you only know because someone else sat beside you while you drove them for the first time. Nervous and careful, hands too tight on the wheel, going slower than the world expected. There are roads that only become yours because someone handed you the wheel and stayed. She said she only came to ask about driving. She came for 9 Saturday mornings. She called me from the DMV parking lot before she called her mother. She fell asleep in my passenger seat in central Wisconsin. She puts her keys on the hook by my front door because it is the most convenient hook for her keys. I think the word for that is not driver. I think the word for that is home. Maybe that is all a route ever is. Not the roads you already know. The roads you learn because there is someone in the car who makes you want to see where they go. She said she didn't ever want a different teacher. I said, for driving? I already knew the answer. I had known it the way you know a road you've driven 100 times, in the body, in the hands, before the brain has finished checking. I just wanted to hear her say it.